This is the Team Performance Podcast, where we explore issues at the heart of leadership, team development, and organisational culture. I'm your host, Mark Gilroy, and in this episode, we're joined by Nigel Watson, a cultural mentor, consultant, and facilitator with over 30 years of experience as a leadership and team coach. In our discussion, we explore Nigel's profound experiences living with Maasai tribes and all the insights that corporate teams can take from tribal environments. What can a business experiencing unprecedented disruption in their industry learn from a tribe who hasn't seen rain for 4 years? Let's find out. So welcome to the latest in our series of interviews. I'm so happy to be joined by Nigel Watson today. Nigel is a leadership and team coach, cultural mentor, consultant and facilitator, and is the founder of a business called Tribal Teams, which I'm sure we'll hear more about along the way. But before we get into that, welcome, Nigel.
Thank you, Mark. How are you?
Yeah, really well, thanks. Really good, really good. Just getting ready for another festive period and a bit of a break over Christmas and New Year. But it's been a really interesting and exciting year.
Yeah, it's been a bit of a mad one, really, hasn't it? Most people I'm
Yeah.
talking to are kind of finding it incredibly busy. But yeah, like you, I'm really, really looking forward to the Christmas break.
One of the first questions I love to ask on this podcast is about your experience of leadership, and particularly, have you got any early memories of recognizing leadership and thinking, oh yeah, that seems to be what this is. That seems to be what we're working with here. What's your earliest memory of leadership?
I think I'm probably a bit unusual in the sense that I think I was kind of pre-programmed to kind of notice stuff like that. So I guess kind of loads of early experiences, probably the first, and I think Dolly went there with hers on your previous interview, which I listened to part of as well, which is lovely. But my father was probably one of the early kind of influences, and in kind of good and bad, so being very candid about that. His consultant surgeon, retired now, but was a consultant surgeon and went on to become a professor of surgery, and was a real leader in his field. So as well as being kind of really busy with kind of big operations and across several hospitals, he would then kind of in his downtime, as it were, design operations. And so he would design these operations that would take out significant amounts of time in how operations got done, and therefore saving lives, and then would kind of go and train people across the world in how to do them. So he was a real leader in his field, and really had this kind of big picture view of things. Nothing really stood in his way. And I guess I probably inherited that bit. And so there's an aspect in terms of admiration and respect for that capability, although from a leadership management perspective, it was probably more one founded on technical expertise than perhaps the people skills. People naturally followed and kind of went where went with his ideas and what he thought, but not necessarily perhaps in the true leadership style that you and I might speak about. But the medical industry is very different. But I think going through schools, and I went through a lot of schools, so we moved quite regularly as he was kind of chasing and growing and developing his career. So we would move to different parts of the country, and then latterly to kind of boarding schools and the like. Then I was fascinated by the impact that different teachers had on me and also other people, both in the kind of the classroom, boarding house, if you like, but also on the sports field. And I was fascinated by how people either turned people off or just had them kind of ticking along and going through the motions, ticking a box almost, or inspiring them. And, I noticed in particular the people that were able to inspire me, and probably the balance was not quite as great as my parents would have liked in terms of on the sports field. I could be very inspired, and perhaps less so in the classroom. But it was interesting to notice the styles and approaches that people took that engaged not just me, but other people, and that sense of being able to really reach their audience and then draw them to a new place. So those things I found fascinating. I was very young of reading, and probably read a bit beyond my years, but anything from I love things like Shackleton, and still use examples from his expedition to look at leadership how-tos, because it just translates. It was brilliant, and that really inspired a, a big drive of my journey through leadership, looking at leadership in the face of adversity, and that was a very significant case study and an example that I'd share and work with clients. But other examples would be people that perhaps sail single-handedly around the world. So understanding about resilience and what it is to really go within and understand yourself and how robust we are and also how vulnerable we are. And that's probably an area that those people that know me know that I'll push on with leaders and leadership teams, is to help open up and grow that aspect of kind of vulnerability and be able to see and work with that from a place of strength. But so those are probably the kind of the early influences, I would say.
Thank you, Nigel. I do. I think it's interesting. We've recorded 3 of these episodes so far. You're the third guest on this podcast, and the other 2 guests so far, Gordon and Dolly, both drew on parents as examples, and that kind of makes intuitive sense that it would be an early example of recognizing leadership, and they were both positive examples as well, and that's true for yours. But teaching is an interesting one, and then it's really extreme leadership like the one you've just described, of the sort of people who would go and take a transatlantic row or a yacht ride and really take that to the extreme. I remember working with a group a few years ago who were just a team of 2, and they had decided to take in order to raise money for charity, they were involved in this initiative whereby they would row from one side of the Atlantic to the other. And it was all around this time of year. So it would take place across December, across the Christmas period, and they would arrive in America. I think it was the Bahamas, somewhere like that, around the New Year. And it was an absolutely tremendous example of all kinds of things. Like you said, resilience. And then just the notion that you would be able to see somebody at the very edges of their capability and limits, with nowhere to hide. And they didn't make it either. The group that I work with, they in their words, they failed, but I don't think anyone would have seen it in that way. But it's such an extreme thing to put yourself through, and I do often wonder what would draw someone to do something like that as a challenge, and whether there are any aspects of their experiences of leadership that might have shaped their models and frameworks of what leadership looks like that might take them on that kind of journey.
Yeah, and it's funny, isn't it? What takes people to the kind of the extremes, the bounds of really pushing their own capabilities and stretching, and some of that's about, kind of personal achievement, I guess, and stretching beyond and getting to that next level and setting records. Some of that, it's about just their own personal journey. Their personal best is exactly that. It's just, a very personal thing. But it's fascinating what inspires people. I think in younger years, one of my kind of great idols, role models was, and there's been plenty, was Ellen MacArthur. And I was fascinated by not just her resilience approach, her ability to be really open, and often females can actually display that, without the same kind of constraints that often you see in males, and you see that in leadership teams. But I love the kind of the rawness of how Ellen operates and communicates, but also what she passes on to other people. But there's somebody that's driven by performance, driven to optimize, and I can relate to that. And I remember reading through. I used to follow her voyages and her races avidly, and I remember reading one of her autobiographies. I remember thinking, God, that was my journey up to about the age of whatever it was, about 14, 15. It was very paralleled, and I remember being on that path and ready, and that's what I was going to do. I was going to sail around the world and do all of those things. And then there was some other things that kind of kicked in and that took me off that path. And it's almost, I can remember the junction. And what I always admired about Ellen is she went on and continued that journey, and she had the courage to go on and continue that journey, and that's probably the biggest difference. And she pushed herself and sailed around the whole of the British Isles, which doesn't sound like that big a feat compared to what she does now. But at the age she did it was remarkable. And, she's just a talented woman. So I always loved those aspects of performance and what people can do, and often, their motivations for doing it. And I think one of the gifts of working in coaching for as long as I have, and I tend to, those who know me will know, I work at quite a deep level with people, and I work very intuitively with people. So we kind of get down and, deep and dirty quite quickly into, what's really going on for people, and fears and things that have impacted their life and how to help them overcome that. So you kind of get that sense then when somebody's sailing around the world, or in a leadership team meeting, what's really going on for them, what's informing those choices of language and behavior and things like that, and what do they need. And yeah, it's fascinating, and how much, I suppose, as we mature and become wiser, in inverted commas, we kind of learn to realize just how much people's behavior can be affected by fears. Sometimes we can get quite angsty when somebody gets angsty with us without necessarily stopping and thinking, they're coming from a position of strength or weakness. How do we unpick that? Is there something going on that they're afraid of? Because if you can find out what's lighting them up, what's concerning them, then we can reach out and have a different conversation and reach a different outcome. So it's funny how all of these things tie together.
It's really quite a primal thing, isn't it? It's incredible. Often when you get to the heart of issues in teams, that it can be these incredibly base primal emotions that are leading our behaviour. I used to see it a lot with change. Teams that are going through change, there's this rhetoric around people who are really anti-change and people who are really pro-change, and I've never really found it to be that binary. Actually, very, very often, if people perceive change as a fear of loss, for example, that's a massive motivator. It's a massive driver, isn't it? And being able to get to the heart of that is a really important insight for anyone who's either leading or experiencing change, because people are likely to react in quite different ways, whether they experience something as a fear of a loss, as opposed to the hope of a gain.
Yeah. It informs so much, and that really is one of the basic fundamentals that drives every decision that we make. Is it fear of loss? Is it thought of gain? Is one of those two, and the variable between them is confidence. And so all of those things are kind of intertwined and interlinked, and our level of confidence affects how much we kind of see the positive in things. But I think in my experience, it's not change that people fear, it's being changed. That's what people are afraid of, is having change imposed on them. And it's that sense of actually, if we can find ways to clearly articulate and reach, ideally in a two-way dialogue, rather than kind of, here it is, this is what's happening. And that sense of context, purpose, and the what's in it for me or what's in it for them, then that makes the world a difference. And in my experience, I've not met anybody that, when you've got that right, hasn't wanted to change and hasn't been a key part of that change. But that's the bit that gets missed sometimes. And sometimes in business, we're busy. And I guess where the name comes from, busyness. But it's that sense that, sometimes we need to slow down to speed up, and we need to do things right. And for me, my passion is about the sense of, how do you create authentic alignment? How do you create authentic engagement? If you like, how do you unleash the tribe within your team or your organization? It's that sense of understanding who they are. If leadership is about leading hearts and minds, the starting point of that is understanding those hearts and minds, and creating that kind of two-way relationship. And that's where the real power, the energy comes from.
I'm really interested to know a bit more about that piece around authentic alignment and unleashing tribes. Before we get there, though, Nigel, I'm curious also to know, you talked a little bit ago when we were talking about Ellen MacArthur, about your path. So you're able to give us a kind of a potted history of your path towards getting to the setup of tribal teams. What took you on that journey? What would been if there was a movie trailer playing?
Okay.
What would appear in that trailer that took you from those early experiences with teachers and parents and leadership towards what I know is a sort of 3-decade career as a coach?
I guess early childhood would have been around. I suppose I remember my mother describing me as how do you always get people to do what you want them to do? And I wouldn't say that was always the case. That might have been the outcome, because I think the painful lessons were that journey to building those relationships and understanding what's important to get in that. And so there's aspects of my childhood where people would kind of look in on that and think, that's brilliant, that's really straightforward. And, I was lucky. My father bought me a small dinghy when I was young, and he taught me to sail when I was 4. And
Gosh.
yeah, I remember leaping on and off boats at a very young age, and he would he developed a love of sailing, and he would book himself onto these courses, and the only way he could really get away with it and justify it, because he had limited time off, would be to kind of take the family away on a holiday, and part of that would be there was a sailing course going on. So he would kind of say, well, and I've arranged one for my mum and for me as well. And invariably my mum would kind of do the first kind of hour and then say, could you just drop me back on shore, please? And she would go back to wherever we were staying, and I would end up having these sailing lessons and doing this amazing things in boats at a young age. It was incredible. And I kind of loved that. So that was great. And so that was kind of quite blessed. But the moving around a lot between different schools meant, every time I went into a new school, I hadn't learned how to kind of integrate gently, and so would end up kind of rubbing people up the wrong way and getting bullied. So, I'd then have to learn how to kind of step back and go into that aspect of vulnerability and, learn to discuss and negotiate. And so I built some really, really lovely relationships, not with everybody, but with key people, and that was deep. And I probably wasn't that as close to my family as it kind of may sound. My father's a brilliant kind of medical person, but not necessarily the best father. And that's taught and informed me a number of things around. For me, one of my great drivers and passions is to be a good or a great father. And I still today don't know what that looks like, but I know what it doesn't look like for me, and that drives me. That's a real passion, and I don't always get it right, but I listen to and notice when I don't, and adapt and change. And children are, one of the biggest gifts you could ever have. And we lost our first, and that was a really difficult time. And that came after a period of learning how to navigate life differently, and so there's all kinds of different kind of journeys, tough and easy in there. But I remember there was a period of time before having our first child where I really wasn't into children. I was into my career, and I was growing that, and it's leadership in the face of adversity and performance under pressure. And I was working in some incredible environments. I was very blessed, and I had an opportunity. So I'd set up my own business. This would be about the age of 30, I guess. And fairly early on into that, I discovered this kind of cultural diagnostic tool, and it was brilliant. And I thought, wow, this is great, because this kind of takes culture into the boardroom, in terms of a boardroom discussion, which, 20 odd years ago, 25 years ago was kind of not really very commonplace. And it looked at culture in the context of bottom line performance. I thought, oh God, I've got to get to know more about this. So the guy that was leading that, the guy called Professor Dan Dennison, he's a wonderful character, literally just retired about a month ago, and good friend. We were sitting, putting the will to right over a couple of whiskeys one night, and he was saying to me, you've got to meet this good friend of mine. He's quite a character. And so I did. I went back and dutifully met this guy. And he was like your archetypal kind of English explorer. And so, Nigel, just back from the Maasai, fucking wonderful people. You must come and see them. You must come and stay with them. So I said, right, okay, let's do it. And so 3 days after the kind of the falling of the Twin Towers, we flew out to Nairobi, and then got a light aircraft and flew over the Rift Valley, and landed kind of on this kind of sand strip just by this most beautiful lodge built into this hillside over the Rift Valley. I thought, well, actually, this isn't going to be as tough as I thought it was. This is going to be quite comfy. And so we then went in, and we met this kind of Maasai leader, which was great, and another warrior. And then they started pointing to where we were going to be heading, which was kind of off on the horizon. And my control mechanisms kicked in, and I remember kind of saying, oh, it's kind of approaching the hottest part of the day. In England, we'll be having 2 liters of water a day, and over here, I'm guessing we need like 4 or 5, and all of these things, all of these control issues coming out. And there I was thinking I was going to be able to offer them so much in leadership in the face of adversity. They'd not had rain for 4.5 years, so there was lots I could teach them about leadership, is what I thought. And And they did what was the most effective thing they could have done with somebody who'd gone into their control place and said, yeah, don't worry about that. We're actually going to have a Land Rover bring round all of the water. So don't worry about that. But you're going to kind of wander across and you'll be with the two Maasai warriors and you'll be perfectly safe. There was never any water that got shipped to us, but it didn't matter by the time we got there because this kind of 5 hour journey across the Rift Valley was just the most incredible stripping away of layer after layer of control. Two people had been killed exactly where we were walking that week, and they were both locals, and they'd been killed by elephant. And so that sense of when we saw the first bit of elephant dung and the Maasai warrior is kind of saying, yeah, that's about 2 or 3 days old. And it's like, okay, that's good. Yeah, this one's about an hour old. So, whoa, okay, what's happening here? And what was really interesting is to watch their processes and to take that comfort from other people's control and not control in the true sense of the word, but just relaxed interpretation of their environment and what's going on around them. So by the time we actually kind of got, 5 hours in, and arrived at this manyatta, this kind of stick corral of Maasai huts, and the next one was about 500 meters away, and the next one about half a mile away, and they're just they're nomadic people, so they're spread across the Rift Valley. It was the most amazing experience, and on the way we'd met somebody else from the neighbouring Samburu tribe who was bringing all of these goats, and he was on his way to market, and the market was on Tuesday. And this was Sunday when we were walking. And he'd set off on Thursday. So it's like, whatever I was worrying about, this was just the guy going to market, but it was going to take him 4 days to get there. We arrived in this manyatta, and, at this point, I wasn't sure about children or having children. And what happened was the two guys I was with, and I paid for a friend and colleague to come out with me who was a ex-Gurkha. And worked in leadership with me. I thought, well, he'd keep me safe as well. And Anthony, so him and Anthony went off and met with the elders. And for some reason, these children gathered around and picked off all of these sticky buds off my laces and socks. And it was like a moment with God. It was was an absolute incredible experience. Time stood still. And it was the most beautiful experience I can ever remember. And these children, in just complete innocence and joy, just sat and picked away at all these sticky buds. And it was just such an act of love, for somebody they'd not met and not with the other two characters that moved on. It moved me. And so during that time with the Maasai, and I have to say, I probably taught them nothing, but I learned more in that week than I'd learned in the whole of my life. Living that life with them was brilliant. And they had a guy called Eric, who's their cultural and spiritual leader. And it's kind of that sense that if every business had one of those, it would be an amazing business, instead of this sense of our values are something that we write out and get people to kind of remember. For any child above the age of 5 can recite their tribe's values, and because that's what they live, it's beautiful. And, they take care of their livestock, their most important asset. The warriors absolutely are charged with that livestock and live outside of the villages. It's an incredible existence, and it works. That's the incredible bit. And so these guys that hadn't had rain for 4.5 years, nobody was down or despondent. Nobody was worried or panicked, and everybody had their processes, and it was just incredible to observe. And I remember saying to Eric, so how do you keep everybody so motivated? How do you do that? And he looked at me like I was some kind of Western idiot. And beautifully said, Nigel, he said, fundamentally, people want to belong. And in order to belong, it's important to contribute. So we make it really easy for people to contribute. And it's like, oh, there's nugget number 2. That really was powerful. And Eric's, the loveliest guy. And I'm due to speak to him later on today as it happens. So the wonder of technology means, we're able to connect and reconnect and keep in touch through, through video calls and the like. So that was massively informative in terms of my career. And I remember a client that I was working with in a company called EDS. They were a large IT kind of facilities management organization, 120,000 people. And so she and I worked very regularly. She was an employee there and a leadership specialist. She's brilliant. And I remember coming back and talking to her about this experience and saying, actually, I really do think it's worth you going out there. And she then led quite a number of trips out there and built a school out there. we had the most amazing time and learned so much. And in fact, Eric a number of times has been over into Western businesses with us, and his ability to be able to just listen to what's going on and strip it back to absolute basics is just, it's incredible to experience. And, one of the best kind of leadership mentors you could have, really. And
Mm.
that was kind of a good part of inspiring me towards, what I do today. And I think I've been in the busyness of all kinds of different things from, culture change and I'm lucky enough to work in changing cultures and designing cultures, which is just wonderful. But in particular, I love the kind of the leadership and the people aspects of that. And so increasingly what I find myself coming back to is that tribal influence and that sense of one of the things we learned through the guy that took us out there was he had this concept called territory mapping, which allows people to visually draw, depict their world, where are the safe pastures, where are their hunting grounds, where are their threats coming from, what do they look like? And what he was able to show me was that you could take a tribal map from any tribe and show it to any other tribe, and they would recognize it straight away. And then what they would do is they'd then draw you theirs. And so I would go and do this. So, I
Wow.
remember going meeting Sami reindeer herders and um, Indian tribal groups. And it's just fantastic. It's just an amazing way to communicate. But what Anthony had identified was this sense that actually here's a really non-conflictual way to be able to talk about businesses. And so, more recent years, I found myself coming back more and more to the sense of basics and, starting to look at, involving some of those guys that teach those processes to bring those into businesses. But for me to look at how do we break down those leadership conversations into something different, something that's more meaningful? And, it's that sense that 10 years ago, we'd have called it soft and fluffy, looking at leadership conversations and things like that. Today, it's an absolute essential and imperative to businesses that we have that fundamental layer of trust and psychological safety within a business. And whilst it looks easy and soft when you have it, the journey to it is difficult, is challenging, sometimes brutal. And that's what people don't understand. And so what I've learned, and I think one of the things that that tribal experience has taught me is the need sometimes to be the person that goes and has those difficult conversations, not from a place of wanting to be difficult, but having an intent set on helping them to be the best people they can be or the best person they can be. And I've had to have
Mm.
several of those conversations this week, but the impact has been phenomenal to be able to then step back and watch that at play. It's like somebody's playing a musical piece. It's lovely, and that's part of the journey, I guess. But feel free to ask anything more.
Oh, I've got so many questions about that. We spend hours on this one, Nigel. Thank you. I promise we won't. Though. I promise we won't. I know you have other places to be and other people to talk to. Not least Alex. I think the thing that really made me in the story so far. The thing I'm really thinking about there is, well, there's two aspects that kind of jumped out. The first one is your kind of 30-year-old self going over there, and you obviously came back with all of this wisdom and a really profound changed mental map and model of how things could be and how things might work that was different to what you'd experienced before. But I'm interested to know what your original intention was before you'd met that tribe, about what you were hoping to convey to them. What sort of things were you hoping to share with them from your map and from your culture that you thought might be of value to them? Do you
I've
remember?
been lucky enough to work with a guy called Humphrey Walters, a friend of mine and a colleague, had started working in this team called Master Inspirational Development, and said, "Look, you must come across and do some of this." At the time, I was setting up my own business, but I
Ah.
said, "Do you know what? Okay, I'll do 20% of my time with you guys." And actually, it was fantastic. It was a gift. Um, and yeah, this was all about looking at different ways of doing things, and in particular, we were part of the team that worked with the 2003 Rugby World Cup squad. So starting with them back in '99 and looking at how to fundamentally, shift and change behaviors and the game almost to the point of going and winning the World Cup. That was the goal, and it was such an audacious goal at the time. And it was about that sense and in particular, I worked alongside and brought him into a number of businesses. A guy called David Allred, who was at the time Johnny Wilkinson's kicking coach for a number of other British Lions team members and the like. But yeah, an incredible guy, and he had a real focus of performance under pressure. And we bring him into different organizations to actually talk about that and create that kind of juxtaposition of being able to look at things kind of differently and from a different perspective. And sport's brilliant for that, to be able to take people to something that they can relate to, where actually performance is everything, and then say, okay, so how do we do that in our own business? And that was the real gift. So I'd learned so much about from all of these people around me about what real performance under pressure looked like. And so it was those kind of lessons that I thought I was going to take out there. I thought we'd sit down and have some discussions and work some stuff out. And they had it all worked out. Life was difficult, but they weren't in crisis because, it would come good. And their world was about processes. And that's the biggest thing I observed, was they didn't need mine. They had theirs and I needed theirs.
Yeah.
That was the difference. And, it was a journey away from ego. I went there with ego as a big part of who I was. And I'd love to say it went overnight. It didn't. It took time. But, to be able to lead and operate and inspire businesses from a place of not ego is really powerful, really lovely. And that's what makes a difference. That's what makes it enduring and sustainable. But it was that sense of thinking I was going to take over a set of processes that would help redesign how they did things. And they didn't need that. In fact, whilst we were there, the neighboring Samburu tribe, in our language, invaded and had their cattle on their last bit of green pasture. They only had one bit of green pasture left. It was like the last kind of 5%, because they'd kind of rationed and organized themselves how they did it. And then this neighboring tribe brought the cattle across because they'd run out. And we thought, wow, okay, here we are. We're going to be, witnessing, the Maasai and the Samburu going to war, going to battle over this. And no, it was all quiet, it was all peaceful. And what happened was the elders got together with the elders and they worked it out. And, I had these conversations with Eric afterwards because he was involved as well. And he said, well, no, they're our brothers. We're not going to punish them for, that they've run out. It's about sharing, respecting that. And that's, I feel quite emotional thinking about it. That was such a powerful lesson because, my experience had been brilliant. I've been gifted, this sense of being able to be around such elite sports people, but it's all about winning and losing. Somebody has to lose for somebody to win. And here they were looking at something different. And that, I think, is something that inspires a different way of doing business. You turn it on its head a little bit and say, how do we create something? And this is one of the things I love about the PCS tool. And one of the things that's just ignited another level in me is this sense of how it's linked to such substantive research and using some of that research in terms of its execution. And I think, data with the human aspect is powerful anyway, but this aspect of drawing on the kind of 70% of performance is coming from climate, and that the climate, 70% of that being influenced by leadership, and that 70% of that leadership is, or that performance, sorry, is intrinsic within people. Therefore, that missing gap, and that's the bit that I've always been looking at, that discretionary performance. That's the bit that really drives me out of bed in the morning, is how do you tap into that? And this provides a kind of mechanism for being able to kind of quantify that and quantify how to get to it. So it tells you, therefore, that discretionary performance is about 30%. And so what fascinated by, and that journey started with the journey out to the Maasai, but linked with the kind of the sports experience, is this sense of how do you get into that extra 30% that you can't command because it's voluntary. It's not there to be given or for people to be told to use it. It's only there if people feel inspired to want to go to that next level. And so that's, I suppose, the journey comes about, how do you create the conditions for success? How do you create the environment where people thrive, where they feel so aligned and engaged, so purposeful in what they do, that's what they want to do, because it's not that that's free time, because to go and recruit that in costs money to businesses. It's that sense that actually everybody's operating that way. But if you've got an organization that's operating that way at that kind of capacity, whatever comes along, they can deal with. And it's that sense of,
Mm.
if you're the Maasai and you've not had rain for 4.5 years, which, by the way, they've
Mm.
just not had, they've just got rain again recently, but they've been through another 4.5 year spell. you know, it's about how do you weather that? What do you do? Because you can't just sit around waiting for it to come. And it's a bit like businesses, the number of businesses I've talked to in the last 6 months where, they pretty much described, we used to go out and kind of just polish our sign at the front of the building and wait for the work to come in. And that doesn't happen
Mm.
anymore. We have a great share of the market and then somebody comes along and completely disrupts it, and suddenly, we've got to
Yeah.
move innovation to the next level. And how do you suddenly find or engage those innovators? And this is where,
Yeah.
the blend of tools with the human things, the data, and again, work with a number of diagnostics. One of those looks at actually how you drive and draw out and identify those game changers in your business, or those people
Mm.
that drive innovation in your business, and how to build the relationships with those so they work well. And yeah, I ran a 3 hour team coaching session with a team that I work with quite regularly yesterday, and we were looking at exactly that. We did that profile and that
Mm.
diagnostic about 3 months ago, but it still comes into our conversation so regularly because it looks at how we do things, how we organize things. So if
Mm.
the Samburu invaded, what would we do? It looks at, we've got this challenge. That's our burning platform. How do we move from there to there? And it's about how do we organize ourselves around what we know, who we are? How do we create that alignment based on that true information, that true data?
Yeah.
So it's
I,
probably a
I
long answer to
really
your question, and apologies for that.
there was a second thing I really wanted to ask you about, but it's kind of
But you dare.
linked. Oh no, no, I absolutely dare. Well, before we do though, I think one of the things I do think there's a bit of a shift in the air. And that people have said that, I'm sure, for years and years and years. Things will change, things will change. The kind of westernized model of how leadership and management and team dynamics is understood will shift. But I do think that is happening. And I think there has been a great leveling off of so much stuff over the last 3 years following the pandemic, that there is a gap open for people to start holding some of this stuff up to the light and go,
Yeah.
this doesn't seem like it works anymore. What else is there? What
Yeah.
what other ways of looking at this could there be? And even so much of that binary nature of, the way you described it as, if one person wins, the other person necessarily loses, or even describing it in those terms as it necessarily has to be about winning and losing. I was at an event earlier this year, a technology conference where they brought together thinkers and academics, as well as practitioners from lots of different areas of the world. And one of the terms that came up that I'd never come across before was the concept of co-opetition. This idea that you can be simultaneously collaborating and competing with a partner in business. So, in these environments where, yeah, like you say, people can't go out and just polish their sign anymore to get business, there has to be fresh ways of growing and developing and even building a new business. That actually a lot of companies are now taking different approaches where they are actively working with a brand that might be seen previously as a competitor and working together in order to find common ground. It's very analogous to
Yeah.
the way you described the Maasai and the neighboring tribe, and that small patch of land that was left.
Yeah.
How can we work together in order to find a productive way forward that benefits everybody? And that's the shift, I think. It's rather than
Yeah.
it being about this person needs to win or this group or this tribe needs to win, it's that shift around a much more utilitarian approach of um, genuinely the greater good is starting to become more open and obvious for people. I'm finding I was working with some students this week, people in the first undergrads, and hearing them talk about motivations and values was just fascinating.
Yeah.
We ran an exercise where they had to kind of decide between two different jobs. One of them was very, very flexible. The other one was a strict kind of 9 to 5, Monday to Friday. And without exception,
yeah,
they looked at the Monday to Friday and just went,
yeah,
no, that's not for
yeah,
me. And I was like, gosh, really?
yeah,
Already
yeah,
that's the first generation for whom this kind of very high, hyper hybrid, ultra flexible way of working will be the norm. They'll be completely native to it. And they've already just gone, no, I don't like
yeah,
that model.
yeah,
So they're going to be building something that's completely different. And
yeah.
that really excites me.
And it's funny, isn't it? Because, in many ways, I'm listening to that and thinking we probably wouldn't have dared, at that age to say
Yeah.
something like that. And actually, it's that kind of daring to be brave, isn't it? Daring to
Oh,
challenge
yeah.
the norm, and that's so needed, and it's that
So
sense of
confident with it.
yeah, yeah, how do you rip up the marketplace and do it differently?
Mm.
And yeah, I had some conversations last night with. I think that's the beauty. One of the things the pandemic's given is that fundamental reset. I now I don't travel. That said, the last month and January are kind of full of travel, but um, in the main I don't. And I can talk to Singapore in the morning, and across Europe during the
Yeah.
day, and States in the evening, and States and Canada last night. I did a conversation, and in fact, I'm over with them in January, and we're looking at actually really how do we expand their marketplaces and help their businesses gear up to do things kind of differently. And they're in a business of saving lives. It's very purposeful, but how do
Mm.
we link people to that purpose so that they can go and stretch? It's not just let's start the new year and let's grow by 10 or 12%. Is actually what does radical stretch growth look like? And what
Mm.
inspires that? And what would we need to do to achieve that? So it's bringing almost some of that kind of childhood influence that those next generations bring into business, to bear across whole organizations. It's quite exciting.
Mm. The second thing I wanted to just ask a little bit more about was when you described around territory mapping.
Mm.
You described territory mapping as something that two tribes would do. And I was interested to know what happened next. So you were talking about two tribes getting together and effectively sharing their map um, in order to see, this is kind of how we are seeing our territory. This is how we're seeing our world and our space. And the other tribe would do the same. What tended to happen next? Because
Well,
before I explain why I was asking that question, I started thinking about what would happen if a Western management team did that with another Western management style team,
and
with
that's what
all
we've
of
had
the
people
ego
doing.
and the model that comes along
Yeah,
with that. Yeah.
yeah, and that's what we had people doing. So the interesting bit is tribes typically don't do that. It was us taking tribal maps, say from Papua New Guinea or
Ah,
Sami
okay.
reindeer herders, and sharing them with other tribes, and then saying, them just looking at that as though it was their own, and then drawing their own. So the interesting thing is, but they don't need to do that because the key here is that they don't need the map because it's all in their head. It's how they live their life. This is what they know.
Wow.
The map is just a depiction of how they see, think, and
Yeah.
operate. And that's really where the magic is. And that once that clicks into place, it's like, okay, now there's the magic of the tribe. And it's then that's the relevance then of a map within a business is the sense of we
Mm.
absolutely know where we are because business has become so complex now and technology has advanced so much that actually we sometimes lose the sense of what's the very essence of who we are and therefore what's the very essence of what we represent and how we communicate and that bringing back to a map a central point sometimes visual and is a lovely non-conflictual way of being able to have the toughest debates around actually we've got a real threat. You're bringing in this technology solution over here. And you have organizations that describe, we've got this here and then we've got bullshit bridge over here. And so sometimes it literally is as literal as that, but you can have a CEO in a room listening to that and taking it. Whereas actually, if you said that in a meeting that I think that's bullshit, people would get very
Yeah.
angsty and it's a bit career limiting. So it's about that ability to transport that kind of that tribal process into a way that is non-conflictual and that allows us to have a different conversation. We then move that further on into that team coaching process that looks at how do we really build that as our everyday language? How do we
Mm.
learn to operate so differently where we're not driven by ego, where we're not concerned about fears, where we recognize actually if somebody is getting angsty, it's probably because they're nervous about something. So let's talk to them about what they're nervous about and how do we co-create a solution that satisfies everybody. And you take that philosophy then outside of the business, and then you've got your kind of co-creation with different partners. And the defense industry has been doing that for a long time. They've been working together. The piece of work that they would bid for, even 15 years ago, 20 years ago, would be so big that they couldn't do it themselves. They didn't have all the expertise. So they would have to partner up and work together in a collaborative way. Yet on perhaps three other examples, they would be in fierce competition with each other. And so it's existed. But I think we're at that stage of maturity now in businesses where we're looking to all of these different examples and saying, how do we pick the best fit for us? How do we make this really work? But also, how do we move ourselves to that next level? What is it that we're not asking? What we're not thinking about? And that's where this sense of nurturing the game changers within our business, or consulting with the game changers and bringing them into our business to look at doing things differently, is so important. And it's shaping up the norm. The future is about challenging the status quo. It's about challenging the norm and saying, how do we get beyond that? And whether that's about product innovation, whether that's about communication innovation, how we get set up structurally. Are we working from home? Are we working from the office? Or is it hybrid? And it's fascinating.
Thank you, Nigel. I think, and I hope our listeners will really get a sense of what it's like to be in a space with you and work with you as a result of this conversation. And I found myself wondering here about some of those really cynical groups, right? You will have come across these, I'm sure. The particular industries, particular teams where you have, the folded arms, the furrowed brows, and just deeply cynical about other approaches for whatever reason. I find myself wondering about, there are lots of people who have had your kinds of experiences abroad, particularly with tribes. I know someone who recently went to India and came back profoundly changed by that experience and meeting working teams there. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And the way you described your experience with the Maasai, it's certainly spiritual, but also kind of bordering on divine, some of the language that you used. I'm wondering how, when you're working with teams in industry, how do you encapsulate and engage with them in a way that doesn't make them feel that they also need to have that experience in order to benefit from that learning?
I think that's a great question. I think the first thing is the nature of tribal teams, and if somebody's wanting to work with me, it's self-selecting to a degree. If somebody's kind of deeply cynical, then they're not really going to be wanting a conversation, never mind, to look at working together. And that's great. That's kind of mutual. It's about where the kind of the progressive leaders, the progressive space that says we need to do something differently. We need to challenge the norm. And so what one might more commonly find is there's pockets of areas and resistance, and pockets of kind of legacy approach and behavior. And I had an example even this week where a particular top team, and they've always had some challenges, and it was how to help them move forward beyond those challenges. And so it was a question of actually showing them a different way of looking at where they are as a team and a construct, actually at a time where there've been some changes to the team dynamic, but to work with some of the key players on that and help them kind of look through a different lens, more importantly, communicate through a different lens and behave from a different perspective, and to have the confidence and faith to do that. And, sometimes it's a bit like our role is it's the conductor of an orchestra in many ways. It's about bringing it all together at the right time, the right tempo, in the right order, and showing people the way. And it's that sense of, I think, being able to role model what you're doing. And I think that's one of the core values really of the team coaching, is that it's about role modeling what good looks like. And there's different ways of doing that face to face, and the majority of my work is remote, so it's really powerful because it's role modeling what does remote working look like, what does remote team performance look like. And when you think about that in the context of 10 years ago, that's mad. Why would we do that? But we're so globalized now that it's critical that we learn to be able to really drive teams and drive performance in a way that we're completely connected. Another team that the team that I described as working with yesterday, there's several of those players that are normally in different countries, even though they're UK based. When we're
Mm,
talking, one of them's the head of sales, so he's always going to be in different places, and it's that sense of always being able to kind of tune in to different people and work with them remotely, even though they're part of a core, in this case, UK team. But so many businesses now are spread kind of globally, and it's that sense that how do we properly engage people at that different level, cynical or otherwise? And it's about
mm,
showing them the way and showing them the impact and the performance. It's not that you have to have had those experiences, but it's around that sense of, people don't fear change, they fear being changed. So it's that sense of helping
mm,
them see what's the context, what's the purpose, so what's in it for them and what's in it for them as a team. And I think the big game in town is getting teams, in particular top teams, to think beyond just their own kind of sphere of influence, their own kind of domain and turf, if you like. And how do they think as a wider team? How do they operate beyond the kind of the sum of the parts and think about that wider leadership perspective? And I think that's the big opportunity.
mm.
And that's the bit that scares a lot of teams senseless. It's just like it's
Yeah.
much easier for me just to manage my area and be quite territorial. And so, how do you break those silos and inspire those leaders to work differently? And I think that's the key. That's really the challenge, and bringing people to a common collaborative way of working rather than this kind of competing style of how we deal with challenge and conflict and things like that. So, it's so important to be able to almost draw on whichever examples are most relevant to those individuals or to those groups that work for them. It's not all things for all people. And I think that's sometimes
Mm,
the challenge for people like you and I is that sense of, it's having a broad base to be able to draw on to bring those experiences to play.
mm,
And, if you've got a group of 8, 9 leaders, you could be needing to draw on 3, 4 different experiences in one session to be able to kind of engage all of those because they don't want to all hear about motorsport or, it's not their
mm,
thing, it's not their bag or rugby or whatever it might be. Um, it's about what works for them and it's about being able to quickly assimilate, I think, their business environment and their business kind of targets and measures and be able to talk in those terms. And I think the importance of, and this is one of the things you really get from tribes, is being able to communicate and build relationships quickly with people means that you move into that trusted advisor capacity very quickly. And so
mm,
you're building up real intelligence, real examples about the business. You're building trust. And what you're looking to do is then to show the way in terms of how to behave with that trust, how to be trustworthy and
mm,
how to explore examples that are based around real data, not academic theory, um,
mm,
and bring it to life in their environment. That's the key, and I think that's where the real green pastures are, if you like, for
mm.
businesses that operate and oscillate, in our worlds, and that's the gift is to be able to kind of help people see that and see it through their own environment, their own map, if you like.
That's a really good place for us to start bringing things to a close. Thank you, Nigel. I'm wondering whether, if people wanted to find out a bit more about you and how they can reach out to you and connect with you about any of the things we talked about today, how could they do that?
So probably the easiest thing is website, which is tribalteams.com, but it's tribal-teams.com. Or people are welcome to kind of reach out directly if they'd like. My email address is nigel@tribal-teams.com.
Brilliant. Thank you, Nigel. And thank you very much for sharing everything that you've shared today. What a wonderful discussion we've had. I've really, really enjoyed it. I've learned a lot. It strikes me that one of the big golden threads there from everything that we've talked about is about kind of movement and travel. It sounds like you're someone who's had that as a bit of a running theme in your life, right? From the kind of getting your first dinghy to sort of traveling around different schools and then moving towards all of your experiences in different cultures and tribes and teams around the world. It seems like there's been a real theme about movement and helping other teams move forward. And I get the sense that people who choose to work with you will be going on quite the journey themselves. Thank you for everything.
That's really kind. Thank you. I appreciate it. And I've really enjoyed it. Thank you.
If you enjoyed this episode, please let us know by subscribing and leaving a review on your favourite podcast app. Meanwhile, if you're interested to learn more about how the PCS approach can help you explore leadership, performance, and culture within your business, get in touch with our team at performanceclimatesystem.com and we'll be happy to help. See you next time with another great guest.